Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, a podcast that aims to address divorce, separation and co-parenting here in the UK, countering the often sensationalist way it's portrayed in the media, challenging the status quo and driving for reform. On each episode, I'm joined by experts to discuss divorce and separation and co-parenting from different angles and to give their opinions and to debate them. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor and divorce coach, co-founder of Amicable and host of the Divorce Podcast. Today I'm joined by Maria Boggio and Graham Landy from Spill. Spill is a health tech startup with a mission to bring high quality therapy to as many people as possible. Maria is head of product at Spill. She has a background in tech as a software engineer and is currently in the process of retraining to become an existential therapist. She has a small clinical practice outside of Spill, working as a volunteer counsellor in bereavement services, as well as working in other organisations offering low-cost therapy. Graham has spent the last 9 years as a practicing counsellor and coach, having retrained from a corporate role for over 25 years. His experience prior to counselling has given him an unparalleled insight to both the fundamentals of the human condition and the pressures of corporate life. Graham is an accredited National Counselling Society member and is also a member of the Association of Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Welcome, Graham and Maria.
Thank you.
Hi.
Nice to be here.
Oh, it's lovely that you're here, and thank you for agreeing to talk to us. I wonder if we can start by just looking at some of the very fundamental things. And we often hear from our customers that they experience a real sense of overwhelm and anxiety when they're going through a divorce and separation. What does anxiety and overwhelm look like in day-to-day terms? What are people going through when they use those labels and those terms? Graham?
Well, anxiety, the way I would define it is it's when we worry about something to the extent that it makes it hard to focus on anything else. Mm-hmm. So we imagine terrible things in the future because that's where anxiety lives, always lives in the future. And moreover, we imagine that we won't be able to cope with them if they arise. And when you think about overwhelm is a feeling that something's just too much to carry. Mm. So if you put them together in that sense, prolonged anxiety, I think, creates overwhelm. And our sense of overwhelm then makes us anxious in a kind of self-perpetuating cycle.
So the two things are really feeding into each other then. So when people are experiencing a life stressor, such as divorce or separation, those things are really then ratcheting up and becoming this kind of cycle.
Exactly. Anxiety becomes all encompassing. Mm-hmm. And when it becomes all encompassing, you drop every other ball that you're trying to juggle in your life. Then you become overwhelmed. And then you get even more anxious about the things you're not able to cope with.
And what are some of the symptoms then? What are people saying, thinking, doing, feeling when they're in that anxious, overwhelmed cycle?
I think one of the things that's very difficult about anxiety is that it affects all aspects of you. Mm. So when you feel anxious, it's affecting you behaviorally, emotionally, physically. So, you might feel agitated. You probably find it very, very difficult to concentrate on things. You might find yourself feeling particularly irritable. You might not be sleeping well, which will worsen all of those other things that you're experiencing. You might forget things. You might physically feel that your heart rate has increased, which in itself will worry you. You might feel nauseous. You'll probably feel that your life is not as interesting as it was before, or you're kind of disengaged from it. And of course, that in itself, that sort of disconnection can lead to feelings of low mood and depression. So it really can set a lot of hairs.
Perfect storm.
Perfect storm, exactly.
Mm. Yeah, I think one thing I'd add to that maybe is that it does seem to have the kind of general feeling of it being quite diffuse. So anxiety is different from fear, which is specific. It's fear about a specific thing, whereas anxiety is this kind of diffuse feeling that something that could grab you and devour you could jump at you from any corner. So I think the way I picture this state of being is a bit as if you had been picked up and dropped into a dark forest at night, and suddenly you're like this. You could be attacked from any corner, so that everything becomes a potential danger. Every ambiguous signal is potentially a sign of threat. And that state of constantly being on the edge is extremely taxing on the body.
And I guess in a divorce or a separation where everything, suddenly all of the things that have been normal and stable in your life are suddenly thrown up in the air, that sense of threat and fear and dread, and the idea that it could be any aspect of the situation that trips you up or plummets you into this black hole of fear or whatever, of not knowing, I guess it just lends itself, that particular stressor lends itself to anxiety and overwhelm because it's coming at you from so many fronts. It could be not knowing where you're going to live, not knowing whether or not you're going to be able to work if suddenly you've got more childcare responsibilities, or not knowing when you're going to see your children if you're having to work. It feels like that it's the perfect opportunity for anxiety and overwhelm to come into your life and to sit there for quite a while.
Yeah, because for most of us, that relationship is central to our lives. Everything hangs off it. Mm. And so if it disappears, it really genuinely feels as if you won't get through it. Mm. It can feel for people as if this journey is going to be too much for me because it has destabilized everything that I once could put my hand on and feel certain about. Mm. And I think that's why divorce and separation is so disorientating for people and creates so much anxiety. Yeah.
So what do you say and what can you say in order to help somebody through that process? So I know that when we talk to people, we try and get them to break it down rather than looking at it as just one big thing that's coming over at you and washing over you like a wave, but just to tackle things one small thing at a time. So when you're helping somebody, either coaching or counselling them through divorce, what are the key things you're trying to do with them or help them with?
I think a lot of the work of helping someone is similar to the work that you do with someone when they're grieving, because, of course, this is a loss. And the way I describe that is there's a lot of emotional holding.
Right.
You're trying to create, I think, for people a stability that they're not feeling anywhere else. One of the reasons I think that the therapeutic space can be so useful in that period of time is because it does stay the same. You do know what to expect. Mm-hmm. It will always be the same every time you come into it. And it always reminds me of a story a therapist friend of mine once told me. He was working with a client who had been divorced, and he wasn't expecting the divorce, and he didn't want the divorce, and it hit him like a truck. And he told me that this client would come into his room every week and he'd sit and he'd say nothing pretty much. He'd cry and he'd be very unable really to put anything together, put any thoughts together or think about the future. And this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And then one day he came in and my friend noticed something different in him. And he said, you seem different today. And he said, yeah, he said, I've realized that whatever happens, I'm going to be okay.
Right.
And so it wasn't so much the intervention.
Yeah.
It was more a willingness to walk through the pain of the separation that he'd experienced until he got to the point where he recognized, actually, I think I'm going to be okay with this. I think I'm going to be able to emerge from it. I think sometimes one of the most difficult jobs in therapy is not doing anything.
Yes. Yeah, I really resonate with what you've just said, Graham, because I think it is any kind of loss brings this grieving with it. And one of the things that I noticed working in grief counselling as opposed to other types of work is that there's a certain devastation. The picture I have in mind often is it's like you're in the aftermath of a tsunami or a flood, complete devastation. And where maybe in other forms of counseling, you might give people an interpretation, an insight, and they kind of take it and they go, that's interesting. With this, I found people, it's almost like you hand someone an object and they're surrounded by debris because there's just been a complete devastation of an earthquake, let's say, and you give them an object and you say, here, put it away. And they look around themselves and like, put it away to where? So there's less of that kind of, let's have insights and sort of debate, re-architecting the house, because the house just been brought down by an earthquake. So it's just complete debris everywhere. And then there's just the sitting with that devastation. And I think what you're saying, Graham, just holding that space and doing nothing, just bearing witness to that devastation feels to be quite a big thing for people in that moment, because it seems often friends and family, perhaps because of their own, it's difficult to sit with difficult emotions, that they maybe minimize the extent of that devastation. And just bearing witness to it and saying, yeah, man, that was hard. Like that is a devastation. That is not a good thing that's happened. I can see that you're sitting amongst the debris of your former life. Just bearing witness to that seems to be doing a lot for people.
And it sounds like there needs to be a slowing down and just the allowing of the passage of time. It was really striking when both of you were talking then. It just felt like there needed to be some space. And I guess, coming from the sort of work that we do, where we're working with people who are ready to move to the next phase and everything is geared around, right, we need to have a plan, we need to do the next thing and the next thing. Sometimes people come too early to that process and they're still at that stage where they just need to sit with their sadness.
Yeah, I literally found myself saying that to someone just recently, saying, it's like a physical wound. You can't be staring at it being like, heal faster, heal faster.
Yes.
There's this natural rhythm at which things heal, and you can't will it. You cannot will time to move faster than it does.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me on to the other thing that sometimes we get asked in this life, which is, how long will it take before my ex is ready to move on to this next stage where we can plan and do things? Or how long will it be until I feel better? And you often get those questions of people wanting, and I guess what they're really asking is this normal, how I'm being? Is it okay for it to be taking this long? And they're looking for that sense of, acceptance that it will take different people different amounts of time to get over certain things, depending on personalities, circumstances, and all sorts of stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I think we do people a disservice when we give them any indication about how long anything will take. It's one of the unfortunate things actually about the various models of grief that exist, because people look at them and they think, oh, that's a roadmap. I'll go through that emotion, then I'll go to the next one, and then I'll go to the next one. Of course, it doesn't work like that at all. You might find yourself angry and then moving into sadness, then back into anger again. And so the thing that I always tell people is the more willing you are to endure whatever emotion hits you on the day, the quicker you will eventually get through to something better. And that might be weeks or months. Sometimes it's years, but the more you resist it, the harder you make it.
So what's the difference then between a normal reaction of, as you say, toing and froing through different emotions, and we have a change curve and it follows a very similar pattern to a grief curve and so on. What's the difference between going through that in a, quote, normal way or a way that isn't clinically worrying versus getting stuck and being able to recognize that actually you've tipped over into something that needs a bit more intervention, perhaps?
Well, I think often one of the signs is the appearance of other mental health difficulties. So if someone, for instance, is so depressed about their breakup that they can't continue in any way with their normal life, then that would be something that I think would obviously need addressing, because if you're letting everything else go, whatever normal is, I don't really know what normal is. I've never met anyone normal, but something that kind of halts you to the extent that everything else is kind of falling apart, that would be a problem. What else? Uncontrollable anger. I think that would be something that probably would need some sort of intervention. It's understandable to feel frustrated or angry sometimes at the end of a relationship. But again, if that anger manifests in such a way that it becomes destructive to you or to anybody else, then that needs attention. Self-medicating. So if you start hitting the bottle or, anything else that is excessive and having a negative impact on your life, any sort of self-abandonment. So if you kind of lose the kind of principles of self-care, thoughts and feelings of self-loathing, some self-doubt, I guess, is pretty normal when a relationship breaks up in many cases. And, finding when people cut themselves off and sort of take themselves away from the healthy parts of their life, their support network, I think all of probably others, but they're the ones that spring to mind that I think would probably be cause for, kind of further investigation and support if you're seeing that in somebody.
Sounds like everything that's making life, potentially creating new problems on top of the original problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And Maria, do you see other mental health issues come to the fore during specifically a divorce or separation?
So there's something in separation, in the loss of a relationship. I think it also comes up if you lose a job, like just basically something that is a feature of your landscape of your life. When that goes away, something happens where I feel like the loss is something to do with maybe confidence in your own ability to understand the world. You kind of stop and you're like, I thought I understood how the world works, but clearly I didn't, because I didn't see this coming, or I couldn't make this work. So, and then the minute that happens, when you begin to doubt yourself and have that feeling of like, I do not know how to navigate the world. I thought I was competent in navigating life, and suddenly I lose faith in that confidence. That is such a fundamental skill, I guess, or something that's so fundamental to us being able to competently navigate our lives, that it can very easily create other problems, right? Because if you start doubting yourself, where does that doubt even stop? It's like, okay, well, this relationship ended. Does it mean that it was a bad match? This particular relationship didn't work? Or is it just me? And is it all people? Am I bad at all relationships forever? And what does that mean? Does that mean that I will be unable to form any meaningful relationships in the future? And has it always been the case? Start doubting the past as well. Has this always been the case? Have I always been bad at relating to people, understanding what's going on for them? If it's particularly unexpected, then you're probably going to call into question every past interaction you've had with that person, being like, how long back has this, when did the house start falling down? How did I miss all of those signs? How am I just completely unable to notice when the house starts crumbling down? When you begin down that train of thought, it's very easy to become very anxious and happy trigger with the anxiety, and be like, every crack in the wall is like, is this a pillar about to crumble down? And I think that can be very debilitating, because I don't know, the world is infinitely complex, and we're finite, and we construct for ourselves this small habitable place that we can just about navigate competently. And when that comes crumbling down, the whole of that complexity and that is the world comes rushing in, and it can be really paralyzing. So 100%, I think it's very possible to start, doubting your ability to relate at work, doubt your ability to maintain close relationships with all sorts of people, isolate. And then that, as Graham was saying just now, exacerbates all sorts of other problems, because it's very easy for those things to become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? If you withdraw from people, then people can withdraw from you in return, and then you become isolated, and then you're like, aha, I knew that I was bad at relationships. Yes. Look, here's proof. And it's very easy for those things to become self-fulfilling prophecies. So yeah, it's I think very possible for other mental health problems to come along, or at least for it to be fertile ground for them to develop, a bit like how, I don't know, it's like
you're giving it the right environment to start, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. It's like you have certain environments that are more like let bacteria grow more. It's a little bit like that. It's like it creates a bit of an environment in which other things can start to develop.
And it sounds like that the sense of trust, the trust of yourself and the trust in others, takes a real hammering in divorce and separation scenarios where one person is left and the other is, left. There's the lever and the left, isn't there, in a divorce? Sometimes I guess there's two levers if it's a mutual agreement, but that seems a lot rarer unless people have had some kind of therapy to come to that joint understanding. What sort of help and support do you find yourselves giving people who are in that divorce and separation scenario, Graham?
In terms of things that they can do to help themselves through?
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things for people to do is to make sure they do rely on their support network. And people tend not to, often in cases of divorce and separation. Sometimes people feel ashamed of the fact that a relationship has failed. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes will make them disconnect. So I would always encourage people to make sure they reach out, that they talk to their friends and family. They make sure that the people around them know how they feel. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people worry that they're going to be seen as a bit of a burden.
Yeah.
But I think that's so far from reality. People want you to be okay. They can't make you okay, but I think you probably find that you make yourself more okay when you're willing to talk about things. So
what does it actually do? So when because we say this a lot, don't we? Reach out to your support network, keep talking. What does it do when you talk to somebody about it? How is your brain or your body getting help?
Well, the most important thing is you're moving away from the echo chamber of your own thoughts.
Right.
So if most people will have an idea in their head about what's happened. I made this mistake. You treated me badly, or whatever it might be. But a lot of those thoughts will be quite self-destructive. And when you open yourself up and just hearing yourself talk about something to someone else, they often don't even have to say anything. It gives you the opportunity to hear your own thoughts. And it makes a big difference hearing what you think than it does just turning it around constantly in your own mind. So I think that's one of the most beneficial things, that you give yourself an opportunity to change the kind of habitual dysfunctional thinking. So that would be the first thing I'd say. The other things, make sure you look after yourself, which is an obvious one, but people, tend not to do that when they're feeling unhappy.
Well, we've had lots of people on the podcast who said they've gone out and done wild and outrageous things, and sort of almost abused themselves as a way of getting over it. But often using that as I don't mean it as a rite of passage, but just that actually was genuinely quite healing to go out and to do.
Let your hair down.
Yeah. Really?
I think, I think that's a good thing. But I think it's worth bearing in mind there's a difference between letting off some steam and self-abandonment and self-abuse. So obviously, we're all adults. You have to decide where that line is, but being aware of that line, I think, is quite important. And the other thing that some people find really, really difficult is don't be too quick to date again. A lot of people tend to jump straight back in. Sometimes, relishing this newfound freedom. I think we massively underestimate the time it takes to grieve the loss of a relationship. Even if we wanted to come out of the relationship, it's very destabilizing on an emotional level. And I think giving yourself some time to resettle and spend some time with yourself is a very important thing to do after a separation.
Yeah, and I think I would add therapy. I mean, I would say this, but honestly, maybe this applies more to bereavement grief rather than relationship breakdown grief. But I don't know, it feels to me like it applies to grief in general, which is that giving yourself that space of therapy can be, at that particular moment in time, can really make the difference between holding yourself accountable to grieving in a healthy, healing way rather than in a self-destructive way, as Graham was saying. And I've heard this from people saying, yes, you should definitely reach out to your support network. However, it's worth being mindful that you may not always get from people the reaction that you need. For example, because people often, all of us, I don't want to say other people, all of us, when we're not specifically creating that dedicated space that is the therapeutic space, all of us find it difficult to sit with difficult emotions. So it's easy for people to say, hey, just start dating again, or hey, why don't you do this? Let's go out drinking, just urge moving on, kind of let's move on, let's get over this type of things, when perhaps more productive would be to sit with the pain. And that's where therapy is different, because a therapist won't say, right, let's just go drinking and cover up the pain, and won't necessarily say, why don't you start dating again now? But rather will be very mindful of, okay, we're crossing this field of grief and it's painful and unpleasant and we can't do it any faster. And let's sit with that. So, you kind of, depending on whose counsel you're seeking, you get different responses. And I think there is something about the response of therapy that is particularly helpful in moments like this, because it's so balanced and unswayed by the emotional needs of the listener, in this case, the therapist.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think certainly, in our experience, when people are coming to the sharp end of having to do something around divorce and separation, whether that's filing for divorce itself or whether it's sorting out children arrangements or financial arrangements, very much the people that have had the therapy are very resourceful and able to meet those challenges far more easily sometimes than people who, haven't had any kind of emotional support and are perhaps still struggling to come to terms with some of the emotional content, and that emotional content leaks out into arrangements and all sorts of things. And it can be quite troublesome.
I just remembered something else. I was reading this research recently into sleep, which was going to be my other point. Sleep, make sure you get enough rest, sleep. And the reason it came to mind is because this series of study had into sleeping and dreaming as a mechanic of processing emotionally difficult experiences. And they particularly looked at people who went through divorce, actually, in one of the conditions, in one of the studies. And they found that people who were dreaming about the relationship were able to process that more. So being able to, and I think this goes hand in hand with therapy and like actually giving yourself space to process, resting, getting enough sleep, I think is part of that recovery process as well. I can get exact references if people want a little live referencing.
Graham, do you think there's a difference between how typically male and female brains handle this kind of process? I mean, it's well documented that men tend to seek therapy less than women, less likely to talk to friends. Are they affected in different ways, the genders, do you think?
I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that people are affected differently in the long term. I think what is different is the way that men typically tend to deal with their emotion, quite often by not dealing with it. So men, I mean, this is a sweeping generalization. This is not true of all men.
Yep.
But men can defer their grieving, sometimes indefinitely. And that makes it very damaging, which is one of the reasons why, men can suffer terrible depression and male suicide rates and so on. Women, in my experience, are better at facing their grief. They seem, on balance, to have a greater willingness to look grief in the face, which means, although they might really hurt, they tend to get through it. Now, I've noticed often when a woman says a relationship's over, it is. Whereas when a man says it's over, it probably isn't.
Oh, interesting.
Because I think once a woman, and again, this is a generalization, but when they get to the point where they've said, I've had enough, that is it, I'm done now, that quite often tends to be the case.
Right.
So I think when you think about what separation and divorce is, a loss, I don't think loss really affects the genders differently. I think it's more about the way that we process and our willingness to show other people how we feel. You might see a lot of anger in men.
Yeah.
But you might not see so much. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're unlikely to see the vulnerable emotions. And obviously it's the vulnerable emotions that enable other people to connect with you.
Yeah, I think Brené Brown points that out. There's a bit of cultural conditioning as well in terms of how much it's socially acceptable for men versus women to express vulnerability and being hurt. And at the end of one of her books, she has an anecdote about a man saying, yeah, well, it's all well and good, for women, but it's less socially acceptable for us, he felt, to express these kinds of feelings of vulnerability, of crying, these kinds of things.
And do you have any top tips for if you're the friend or the relative of somebody who's going through a divorce? Because we've talked about the difference between specialist and non-specialist help. Obviously, as you said before, specialist help can really help you process and move on. Not everybody is either going to be in a position where they want to, can afford to, or are willing to go into some kind of therapeutic process for all sorts of reasons. So if you're the friend of somebody who's going through a divorce or separation, what are the best things you can do to help?
Listen, without judgment and without trying to fix it. Because when obviously some relationships get back on track, but I think the assumption that they will is dangerous, or trying to get people to do certain things to hasten them through their grief is often unhelpful. I think you are the best type of friend when you're willing to stand with someone who's in pain without trying to take their pain away from them, because that means that you're recognizing that their pain is not yours. So I think that's the best, that's the sort of friend I'd want in that situation.
Okay. So you don't want the friend who's going to say, oh yeah, he or she's an awful person and you're best rid of them. You don't want that kind of friend.
I don't want that, because I think that sort of friend is going to hasten me into therapy.
Right.
Because the most likely scenario there is that I'll end up feeling bitter and resentful about my ex-partner. And that is going to give me many more problems in the long run. I know it's a very, very difficult notion for a lot of people, but the very best way to come out of your divorce or separation is in a place where you don't feel bitter and resentful about what's happened or about your partner, at least in the long term, because that enables you and your partner, but you ostensibly, to get on with your life and put it behind you and move forwards. Whereas if someone's stoking up a lot of bitterness and resentment and anger in you, that isn't helpful. You know, good things don't come from negative emotion.
And maybe for the friend who's doing this listening, hopefully, as Graham suggests, what I would maybe also say is that that friend is mindful of their own self-care, because listening to someone can be quite difficult, and just acknowledging that and drawing some boundaries around it as well might be helpful, because, you know, listening to someone go through a tough time is really difficult, and maybe saying, look, let's talk about it for an hour and then I have to go, and maybe drawing some boundaries can really help that friend truly be there and sit there without jolling that person along, because they know they only have to do it for that amount of time. And I think boundaries here, it's a little bit like, you know, boundaries in the real world. Like if there's a barrier on the edge of the cliff, I can go right up to the edge. But if there isn't a barrier, then I tend to stay well away. And actually, in that sense, barriers help me approach the danger better than there not being a boundary. And in this case, the danger is grief. It's like people are scared of negative emotion. They're scared of opening that can of worms because there's no boundary there. They're like, I'm not even going to ask that person how they're feeling because I don't know how to close that conversation again. So having a little bit of a boundary and saying, look, I can spend an hour with you today and listening to how you're feeling, and then I'm going to go. And or having a boundary around what's possible for that person to take on. And when you get to the limit where you feel, you know, actually, I don't feel I am qualified to be able to advise you on what you're feeling right now, I would really urge you to maybe try and speak to a therapist. I think that would be more helpful to you. This is as much as I am able to offer. I think that's another kind of boundary, saying this is as much as I am able to offer, you know, especially if the person is expressing anything to do self-harm, or, you know, if you're worried about that person, that's a lot to take on. And saying that I don't feel qualified to help him, but I really want you to have this help. Could we maybe sit down and find you someone? Is another way of kind of containing the pain, the grief, and making sure that you're there for people.
Thank you, both of you. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm really sorry, but we're going to run out of time now. So
we're going
to have to draw it to a close, but it's been really interesting running through and listening to the different emotions in a more granular level that happen when people divorce and separate, and really understanding the difference in terms of what symptoms they might be having and looking at the help that people can get as well. So thank you very much indeed for sharing your expertise and your time with us this afternoon. Really appreciate it. Maria, where can people find out more about you?
If you go to spill.chat, you will be able to learn lots about Spill, and I think potentially also about us. We used to have a page, and I think maybe Graham is still on the website. But if you have any further questions, if you have questions where you're like, actually, I want to follow up on this, I don't know, maybe they can get in touch with you or hi at spill.chat.
We'll pass on the questions to Spill. That's no problem.
More information for sure.
And Graham, what about you? Are you also on the Spill website?
I don't know if I'm personally on the Spill website. If you wanted to find me personally, you'd have to find my website, which is at grahamlandywellbeing.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you both. It's been absolutely fascinating. You can find out more about me. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Kate_Daly. You can hear about new podcast episodes by following at divorce_podcast. And of course, you can subscribe to this podcast by visiting thedivorcepodcast.com. Thanks very much for your time, both of you. And thank you, everybody, for listening.